5,000 Roman soldiers marched into the north and were never seen again. This wasn't just a minor patrol getting lost in the mists of Caledonia. This was the 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, one of Rome's most seasoned and feared fighting forces. An entire legion, complete with its cavalry, its auxiliaries, its siege engineers, and its sacred eagle standard, simply vanished from the historical record. So how does that happen? How does an entire army, the backbone of the Roman Empire's military might, just disappear without a trace? Because to understand their disappearance, we need to understand Rome's obsession with expansion. From its humble beginnings as a small city-state, Rome was driven by an insatiable hunger for conquest. By the 1st century AD, its empire stretched from the scorching deserts of Syria to the rainy shores of Britain. But there was one place, one stubborn corner of the known world, that refused to bow: the wild, untamed lands north of what would become Hadrian's Wall. The Romans called it Caledonia. Today, we call it Scotland, for the ambitious governors of Roman Britain, conquering this final frontier was the ultimate prize. It meant glory, wealth, and the favor of the emperor. One such governor was Gnaeus Julius Agricola. He was a brilliant general, and in the year 82 AD, he pushed his legions, including the 9th, deeper into Caledonia than any Roman had gone before. The 9th Legion had a long and storied history. They had fought alongside Julius Caesar in Gaul. They had crushed rebellions in Spain, earning them the name Hispana. They were veterans, hardened by decades of warfare across the empire. Led by their legate, they were a self-contained city on the march over 5,000 heavily armed legionaries, supported by thousands of auxiliary troops recruited from conquered peoples. Each man was a disciplined killing machine, trained to fight as part of an unstoppable unit. Their shield wall, the testudo, was nearly impenetrable. Their short sword, the gladius, was brutally efficient. They were the very symbol of Roman power. To the tribes of Caledonia, they must have seemed like monsters from another world, clad in iron, marching in perfect, terrifying unison. This was the force that marched into the mists. The land they entered was unlike anything they had known. This wasn't the open terrain of Gaul or the dry hills of Judea. Caledonia was a labyrinth of dense forests, treacherous bogs, and rolling hills shrouded in perpetual fog. The Celts and Picts who lived here were masters of this environment. They didn't fight in neat lines like the Romans. They were masters of guerrilla warfare. They would strike from the shadows of the forest, unleash a volley of spears, and then melt back into the mist before the Romans could even form a line. For the 9th, marching in tight formation through this claustrophobic landscape, every shadowed glen, every thicket of trees, held the threat of a sudden, brutal ambush. The psychological toll must have been immense. The constant tension, the unseen enemy, the biting cold, and the disorienting fog would have worn down even the most disciplined soldiers. So what are the theories? What could have possibly happened to them? The most popular and dramatic theory is that the 9th Legion was annihilated in a massive battle. One story, which comes to us from later Roman historians, suggests that the legion was caught in a surprise night attack by a coalition of Caledonian tribes. Imagine the scene. The legion is encamped, weary from a long day's march. Suddenly, the night erupts with the sound of war horns and the screams of thousands of warriors pouring out of the darkness. In the chaos and confusion, the legion's disciplined formations would have broken down. It would have been a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle for survival in the dark. If this is what happened, it would have been a catastrophic defeat for Rome, a humiliation so great they might have chosen to strike the 9th from their official records to pretend it never existed. But there are other, less bloody possibilities. Some historians argue that there was no single, dramatic last stand. Instead, the legion may have been slowly bled white over years of grueling attritional warfare. Constant raids, ambushes, and skirmishes could have whittled down their numbers until the unit was no longer combat effective. The remaining soldiers might have been disbanded and absorbed into other legions. In this scenario, the 9th didn't vanish in a blaze of glory. It simply faded away. There is also evidence to suggest that detachments of the Ninth Legion were transferred to other parts of the empire, like the Rhine frontier or the East, before the unit was officially dissolved. If this is true, the mystery isn't about a lost army, but about a historical clerical error, a simple failure to record the Legion's final movements and decommissioning. Perhaps the most intriguing clue comes not from a history book, but from archaeology. In 1864, a bronze eagle was found in the town of Silchester, in southern England. It's a magnificent piece, but its right wing is broken. Some have speculated that this could be the lost eagle standard of the Ninth Legion, recovered from the battlefield and buried for safekeeping. The eagle, or Aquila, was the soul of the Legion. To lose it in battle was the ultimate disgrace. Is it possible that a handful of survivors fought their way out of the disaster, carrying their wounded eagle, only to bury it so it would never fall into enemy hands? The Silchester eagle is a powerful, tangible link to this mystery, a silent testament to a story we may never fully know. It asks a question without giving an answer. So what does all this mean? The story of the Ninth Legion is more than just a historical cold case. It's a story about the limits of power, about the clash of civilizations, and about how even the greatest empires can be humbled. It reminds us that history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the survivors, and sometimes it's not written at all. It's swallowed by the fog, leaving behind only whispers and a mystery that endures for 2,000 years. The fate of those 5,000 men remains one of history's most compelling enigmas, a ghost legion marching forever through the mists of the North. Thank you so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the mysteries of the ancient world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's greatest unanswered questions. Let me know in the comments which theory about the Ninth Legion you find most convincing. We'll see you in the next one.
History isn't just what happened, it's what was hidden. Welcome to the Chrono Archives, where lost empires rise again, forgotten legends speak, and ancient truths are brought back to life. From world-shaping history and powerful myths to legendary rulers and timeless civilizations, every story here is carefully uncovered, deeply researched, and cinematically told. The past is calling, will you answer? Subscribe and journey through time, one unforgettable chronicle at a time.
By the turn of the 2nd century, the Roman Empire was more than just a place on a map, it was the world. From the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia to the misty shores of Britannia, the golden eagle of the legions cast a shadow that touched nearly every known corner of the globe. Under emperors like Trajan, Rome reached its absolute zenith, a sprawling colossus of engineering marvels, military might, and unparalleled wealth. Think of the bustling forums of Rome itself, the heart of this vast body, pumping laws, culture, and commerce to its farthest limbs. Aqueducts, like stony arteries, carried life-giving water across entire landscapes. Roads, straight and true, bound the empire together, allowing armies to march and merchants to travel with a speed and safety the world had never known. On the frontiers, the legions were the embodiment of this power. Their discipline was legendary. Day after day, from Syria to the Rhine, they drilled. The rhythmic stamp of their hobnailed sandals, the gleam of their segmented armor, the sharp commands of their centurions, this was the machine that had conquered the world. It was a spectacle of order and strength, a living wall against the barbarians who pressed in from the unknown. To an observer, it would have seemed that Rome was eternal, its foundations unshakable, its future limitless. But even the mightiest structures have their breaking points. The very size that made Rome so magnificent was also its greatest vulnerability. Every inch of its vast border demanded protection, and every new conquest only extended that border further. And no frontier was more troublesome, more persistently rebellious, than the cold, damp island of Britain. For the Romans, Britain was the edge of the world. It was a land of dense forests, treacherous bogs, and fierce tribes who refused to bow to Roman authority. The cost in blood and treasure to hold this island was immense. Was it even worth it? This was a question whispered in the halls of the Senate and debated in the tents of generals. The island produced some grain, some minerals, yes, but its true value was symbolic. To retreat from Britain would be to admit that there was a limit to Roman power, a concept that was unthinkable. So, the legion stayed. They built forts of stone and earth, like the imposing fortress of Ebercum, which we now know as York. They patrolled the rugged landscapes, a constant, occupying force in a hostile land. And among these legions was one with a long and storied history, the Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Hispanic Legion. Forged in the crucible of civil wars and hardened by campaigns across the continent, the 9th was a veteran unit, respected and feared. They were the guardians of the northern frontier in Britain, stationed at Ebercum, tasked with the impossible job of pacifying the wild tribes of the north, the people the Romans called the Caledonians. These were not the organized armies Rome was used to fighting. They were elusive, masters of guerrilla warfare, who would strike from the mists and vanish back into the unforgiving highlands. For the men of the 9th, life was a constant state of alert. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping into their bones. The dampness rotted their leather gear. The locals were a constant, simmering threat. Every patrol that left the gates of the fortress was a gamble. Would they return? The psychological toll was enormous. Far from the warm sun of Italy, these soldiers were isolated, holding a line against a world that seemed to actively want them gone. Could Rome truly control this northern wilderness? Or were they just pouring legionaries into a bottomless pit? The generals on the ground knew the situation was precarious. The emperor, far away in Rome, saw only lines on a map and reports of skirmishes. He saw a problem that needed a decisive, final solution. The pressure from the top was immense. Emperor Trajan, and later his successor Hadrian, were men who understood the importance of secure borders. The constant raids and uprisings in northern Britain were a thorn in the side of the empire, a drain on resources and a stain on its prestige. The time for containment was over. A new strategy was needed. The order came down: push north. End the threat of the Caledonians once and for all. It was to be a massive campaign, a final, decisive blow to bring the entire island of Britain under the heel of Rome. The 9th Legion, being the most experienced unit on that frontier, would be at the heart of this great advance. They were to march into the heart of Caledonia, into lands no Roman army had ever successfully penetrated, and crush the resistance. For the commanders, the plan must have seemed audacious, perhaps even reckless. They were walking into the unknown. Their maps were incomplete. Their intelligence on the enemy was patchy at best. They knew the tribes were fierce, but they didn't know their numbers, their leadership, or their strategy. They were marching into a landscape that was itself a weapon, a maze of mountains, forests, and ravines perfect for ambush. But an order was an order. The legionaries of the 9th prepared themselves. They checked their armor, sharpened their swords, and packed their rations. They were professionals. They had faced daunting odds before and had always prevailed. This time, however, would be different. This one campaign, this one push into the misty highlands of what we now call Scotland, would push them too far. They were marching toward a destiny that no one could have foreseen. As the year 117 AD dawned, a sense of grim determination settled over the fortress at Ebercum. The final preparations were made. Standards were polished, supplies were loaded onto carts, and the trumpet sounded the call to assemble. Thousands of men, the pride of the Roman army, formed up in their centuries, their faces set and determined. They were marching north to secure the frontier and bring glory to the empire. They were marching towards a confrontation that would echo through history, leaving behind a mystery that has puzzled historians for 2,000 years. The frontier was a tinderbox, and the 9th Legion was the spark. In 117 AD, the northern frontier of Roman Britain didn't just simmer, it exploded. The year is 117 AD. The Roman Empire, under the seemingly endless reign of Emperor Trajan, stretches from the scorching sands of Mesopotamia to the misty shores of Britain. On this northernmost frontier, a fragile peace holds, or so they thought. For decades, the Ninth Legion, Legio IX Hispana, had stood as a bulwark against the untamed tribes of the north. They were the iron fist of Rome, stationed at Ebracum, modern-day York, a symbol of unshakable power, but power can breed complacency. And in the wild, rugged highlands of Caledonia, resentment was simmering, waiting for the right moment to boil over. The tribes of Britain, the Brigantes, and their neighbors had never truly bent the knee. They paid their taxes, they traded their goods, but they watched the Romans with a cold, patient hatred. They saw the grand villas, the paved roads, the imposing forts, not as progress, but as chains. They remembered the tales of Boudica, of the fierce resistance their ancestors had mounted. That spirit wasn't dead, it was merely sleeping. And as whispers of dissent traveled on the wind from village to village, a plan began to form. A plan to push the eagle back into the sea. It started subtly. A supply convoy vanished on a lonely road. A small patrol, sent to investigate, never returned. Roman officials dismissed these as isolated incidents, the work of common bandits. They failed to see the pattern, the growing coordination. They underestimated the enemy at their doorstep. They believed the tribes were fractured, incapable of organized warfare. This was their first and most fatal mistake. They were walking into a trap, not of iron and steel, but of their own arrogance. The storm was about to break, and the Ninth Legion was standing directly in its path. The attack came at night, under the cloak of a moonless sky and driving rain. Not on the main fortress at Ebracum, but on the smaller, more vulnerable outposts that dotted the frontier. At the fort of Vindolanda, the sentries on the wooden ramparts strained to see through the gloom. They heard nothing but the howl of the wind. Then, suddenly, the darkness erupted. Flaming arrows arced through the sky, thudding into the timber walls and thatched roofs. Within moments, the night was alive with fire and the terrifying sound of the Celtic war horn, a deep, guttural cry that promised slaughter. Warriors surged from the tree line, their faces painted with woad, their long swords and axes gleaming in the firelight. They moved with a terrifying speed and ferocity, overwhelming the outer defenses before the Romans could even form a proper shield wall. The auxiliaries, many recruited from Gallic and Germanic tribes, fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and caught completely by surprise. Chaos reigned within the fort. Roman commanders shouted orders that were lost in the din of battle. The air grew thick with smoke, the smell of burning wood, and the bitter tang of blood. Civilians, the families of soldiers and merchants who lived alongside the legionaries, screamed as they fled their burning homes, only to be cut down by the charging warriors. This wasn't just a raid, it was an extermination. The tribes were not looking for plunder, they were erasing the Roman presence from their lands, one fort at a time. The same scene of carnage was repeated up and down the frontier line. From Luguvium to Coria, Roman forts were overrun, their garrisons slaughtered to a man. News traveled slowly, carried by the few desperate survivors who managed to break through the enemy lines and flee south. When the reports finally reached the commander of the Ninth Legion at Ebracum, the picture they painted was one of absolute disaster. The entire northern frontier had collapsed. There was no time for deliberation, no time to wait for reinforcements from the south. The honor of Rome was at stake. The commander, whose name is lost to history, had no choice but to act. He gathered the full strength of the Ninth Legion, nearly 5,000 seasoned veterans, the pride of the Roman army. Their orders were clear: march north, relieve any surviving garrisons, crush the rebellion, and restore order. They were to make an example of the northern tribes, to burn their villages and salt their fields, to ensure that no one would ever dare to challenge Roman authority again. As the great iron-studded gates of Ebracum swung open, the legion marched out in perfect formation. Sunlight glinted off their polished helmets and segmented armor. The eagle standard, the Aquila, held high at the front, was a symbol of their invincibility. They were the Ninth, the Hispania. They had fought in Gaul, in Germania, in Spain. They had never known defeat. The soldiers marched with grim determination, their hobnailed sandals pounding a relentless rhythm on the stone road. They were confident, perhaps overconfident. They were marching to punish a disorganized rabble of barbarians. They pushed deep into hostile territory, the land growing wilder and more foreboding with every mile. The manicured fields and villas of Roman Britain gave way to dense, dark forests and mist-shrouded hills. The paved roads disappeared, forcing them onto muddy tracks. They found the forts they were sent to relieve, but all they found were smoking ruins and the unburied bodies of their comrades. There were no survivors. The enemy was a ghost, melting away into the landscape whenever the legion approached, only to reappear and harass their flanks and supply lines. Small patrols sent into the woods simply vanished. The mood among the soldiers began to shift from confidence to a gnawing anxiety. The air was thick with unseen menace. They were being led on, deeper and deeper into the heart of Caledonia, modern-day Scotland. Every step took them further from safety, further from support. The tribal leader, a brilliant and ruthless strategist, was baiting the trap. He knew he couldn't defeat the legion in a pitched battle, not on open ground, so he chose the ground himself. He drew them into the Scottish Highlands, a place of narrow glens, dense forests, and treacherous bogs, a landscape the Romans did not understand, but which his warriors knew like the backs of their hands. The 9th Legion, marching to restore order, was walking into an ambush on a scale they could never have imagined. Something went terribly, catastrophically wrong. The legion marched north, and then there was only silence. The 9th Spanish Legion, Hispana, a name etched into the very bedrock of Roman military glory. For over 2 centuries, they were the iron fist of the empire, pushing its boundaries, crushing rebellions, and planting the eagle standard in conquered lands. From the sun-scorched plains of Hispania to the misty fields of Germania, their reputation was legendary. They were veterans, hardened by countless campaigns. They were the emperor's finest. And then, after the year 120 AD, they vanished. Not a single mention, not one record. It's as if a legion of nearly 6,000 of the most elite soldiers on Earth simply walked off the face of the planet. What happened to them? This is one of history's greatest and most chilling mysteries. For decades, historians believed they were wiped out in Britain. A glorious last stand against the northern tribes, a story of doomed heroism. But modern archaeology has complicated that picture, suggesting they might have been transferred east to fight in other wars. Yet, the silence in the records remains deafening. Today, we're going to explore the most enduring and terrifying theory. The one that has captured the imagination for centuries. The story of a proud legion marching north into the mists of what is now Scotland to punish the Pictish tribes ... and never returning. We're stepping back in time, not just to recount history, but to walk with them, step by step, into the heart of the darkness that may have consumed the legendary 9th. Our story begins around the year 117 AD. The Roman frontier in Britain is a bloody, chaotic mess. The Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall, hasn't been built yet. Instead, a series of forts and roads, known as the Stanigate Line, marks the edge of the known world. Beyond it lies Caledonia, modern-day Scotland, a land of impenetrable forests, jagged mountains, and relentless mist. It's a place Roman commanders describe with a mixture of contempt and fear. A land inhabited by the Picts, the Painted Ones. These were not disorganized barbarians, they were a confederation of fierce, resilient tribes who refused to bow to Roman rule. They waged a brutal guerrilla war, appearing from the mist to strike, and then melting back into the unforgiving landscape. For the Roman soldiers stationed on the frontier, it was a nightmare. Constant raids, ambushes, and the gnawing psychological toll of fighting an enemy they couldn't see, in a land that felt alive and hostile. The 9th Legion, stationed at Ebercombe, or modern-day York, would have been at the forefront of this struggle. They were the bulwark against the chaos, frustration in the Roman high command is boiling over. These constant raids are more than an annoyance. They're an embarrassment to the empire's might. A decision is made, a punitive expedition. It's time to teach the Caledonian tribes a lesson they will never forget. The objective is clear: march north, find the enemy, and annihilate them. The 9th Legion is chosen for the task. They are the best suited for it. Battle-hardened, disciplined, and led by a commander who knows the brutal calculus of frontier warfare. As they muster in York, the mood is one of grim determination. They are not conquerors on this mission, they are exterminators. They pack weeks of supplies, sharpen their gladius swords, and check the leather straps on their iconic shields, the scutum. Their armor, the larica segmentata, is polished to a gleam, a river of steel and iron ready to flow north. They are a symbol of order, of civilization, marching into a world the Romans considered pure chaos. As they march out of the gates of Ebercum, thousands of hobnailed sandals, striking the stone road in perfect unison, no one could have known they were marching towards a complete and utter void in the historical record. Their last known location is here, at their fortress in York. After this, we must rely on speculation, on legend, and on the terrifying silence they left behind. The march begins. At first, it's familiar territory. The legion moves along the well-established Roman roads, a marvel of engineering that cuts through the landscape. Supply wagons trundle behind them, and communication with the south is still possible. They pass by Roman forts, familiar sights that offer a sense of security. The disciplined columns of legionaries, their red cloaks a stark contrast to the green countryside, are a picture of imperial power. But with every day's march north, the landscape begins to change. The rolling hills become steeper, the forests darker and more dense. The meticulously crafted Roman roads give way to rough, muddy tracks. The land itself seems to resist them, and then they make a fateful decision. To truly bring the fight to the picks, they can't stick to the known paths. They have to plunge into the wilderness, the untamed heart of Caledonia. The legion leaves the established roads behind and marches into the unknown. This is a calculated risk. The commander knows that he is stretching his supply lines to their absolute limit. Every mile they travel into the interior is a mile they will have to travel back. The wagons can't follow them over this terrain. From now on, they carry only what they can on their backs. The world transforms. They are now in the Scottish Highlands. This is not the Britain they know. The ground is a treacherous mix of rock and bog. The air grows cold, and a persistent, chilling rain begins to fall, soaking their woolen cloaks and leather gear. It seeps into their bones, a constant, miserable companion. The mood of grim determination begins to curdle into something else: isolation. They are utterly alone. The legion, a symbol of Roman order, is now a tiny, vulnerable island of humanity in a vast, hostile wilderness. The commander relies on his scouts, the eyes and ears of the army, to navigate this alien terrain and find any sign of the enemy. Small groups of men, skilled and swift, fan out from the main column, disappearing into the mist and trees. But then, a scout party fails to return. Another one vanishes without a trace. There are no bodies, no signs of a struggle. They are simply gone. Fear, a cold and creeping dread, begins to infect the ranks. The soldiers are exhausted, not from battle, but from the sheer effort of marching through this punishing land. Morale plummets. Every shadow on a distant hill, every strange noise carried on the wind, becomes a potential threat. The men start seeing things, or maybe they aren't imagining them. Fleeting figures, shadow-like shapes, watching them from the cliff tops and then disappearing the moment they are spotted. They are being herded, they are being watched. They are walking into a trap, and then history goes silent. There is no record of what happened next. The official Roman archives, so meticulous in documenting everything from battle casualties to grain shipments, contain nothing. The silence is absolute, and it's this silence that allows the most terrifying questions to take root. What happened in those misty highlands? We're left to imagine the final moments of the Ninth Legion. Did they, exhausted and demoralized, finally lose their famous discipline? Did the tight, impenetrable formations that had conquered a world fall apart in the face of an unseen enemy and an unforgiving environment? Was the Legion, stretched out and struggling through a narrow glen, suddenly surrounded? Imagine the horror. The war horns of the Picts echoing from the hills on all sides. Thousands of painted warriors charging down from the high ground, a terrifying wave of humanity crashing down on the trapped and weary Romans. Or perhaps it wasn't the enemy that defeated them at all, perhaps it was the land itself. Did the relentless rain turn a valley into a death trap of mud and flash floods? Did they succumb to starvation and disease, their strength sapped until they could no longer even lift their shields? The truth is, we will never know. The Ninth Legion marched into the mists of Caledonia and was swallowed by the darkness. Their eagle standard, their pride, their very existence was erased. They became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by legionaries on the frontier for generations to come. A chilling reminder that even the might of Rome had its limits, and that some places, and some people, would never be conquered. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries. If you find these lost stories of the past as fascinating as we do, please consider subscribing and joining our community of history explorers. For over a century, the story of the Ninth Legion has been one of heroic sacrifice, a final, desperate stand against overwhelming odds in the misty highlands of Caledonia. We've been told they marched into the fog and were never seen again, erased from the annals of Rome. It's a compelling narrative, a perfect ghost story from the ancient world. But what if that story, the one we've all heard, is completely wrong? What if the disappearance of the Ninth wasn't a brutal massacre, but something far more mundane, yet equally mysterious? The evidence we've clung to, the idea of a legion wiped out in Britain, is surprisingly thin. For years, it was based more on what wasn't said than what was. The lack of later records in Britain was taken as proof of their destruction. It was a simple, dramatic explanation that fit neatly with Rome's struggles on its northern frontier. But history is rarely that simple, and as archaeologists and historians have dug deeper, not just in the soil of Britain, but across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, a different picture has begun to emerge. The silence surrounding the Ninth might not be the silence of the grave, but the silence of a story deliberately forgotten or simply lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of a massive empire. The first major crack in the traditional story appeared not in the windswept hills of Scotland, but hundreds of miles away, in the city of Nijmegen in the modern-day Netherlands. There, archaeologists uncovered tiles stamped with the mark of the Ninth Legion, Legio IX Hispana. These weren't just a few scattered pieces. They were roof tiles from the legionary fortress. This discovery was seismic. The tiles dated to a period after the legion was supposed to have been annihilated in Britain. Suddenly, the narrative of a bloody end in Caledonia was thrown into chaos. How could a legion that was supposedly wiped out be building barracks on the Rhine frontier? This wasn't a ghost legion. This was a working military unit, active and accounted for, long after their supposed demise. The presence of the Ninth in Nijmegen suggests a far less dramatic, but historically more plausible scenario, a simple redeployment. Legions were the Empire's mobile peacekeeping force, constantly being shifted to where they were needed most. It's entirely possible that after their service in Britain, the Ninth was quietly moved to Germania Inferior to reinforce the Rhine frontier, a perpetually volatile region. Their disappearance from Britain wasn't a mystery, it was a transfer. So, if the Ninth wasn't destroyed in Britain, and was instead transferred to the Rhine, where did they go from there? This is where the story takes another turn, leading us from the forests of Germania to the sun-scorched deserts of the East. The Roman Empire was vast, and its frontiers were under constant pressure. While the Rhine was a hotspot, an even greater threat was brewing on the eastern border with the Parthian Empire. Around 115 AD, the Emperor Trajan launched a massive campaign against Parthia, a war that would push the Roman legions to their absolute limit. Later, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, another devastating war erupted in the east. It's in the context of these brutal eastern wars that some historians believe we find the ultimate fate of the ninth. A 2nd century historian, Cassius Dio, mentions a Roman legion being annihilated in Armenia by the Parthians around 161 AD. While he doesn't name the legion, the timeline is tantalizing. Could this unnamed legion be our missing ninth? It's a compelling theory. A transfer from the Rhine to the east to fight the Parthians would make strategic sense. A legion seasoned on the tough frontiers of Britain and Germania would be a valuable asset in such a difficult campaign. If this theory is correct, the 9th Legion met its end, not in the mists of Scotland, but under the harsh sun of the Middle East, fighting a completely different enemy. Their end was still violent and tragic, but it happened a generation later, and a continent away from where the legend places it. This brings us to a fascinating question. If the legion was really destroyed in the east, why did the story of their demise in Britain become the dominant narrative? Why did a military disaster in Parthia get transplanted to Caledonia? The answer might lie in the power of storytelling and political spin. The supposed massacre in Britain served a purpose. It was a dramatic tale that highlighted the savagery of the northern barbarians and justified Rome's massive military presence there, including the eventual construction of Hadrian's Wall. It was a convenient, localized explanation for a missing legion. On the other hand, admitting a catastrophic defeat against the powerful Parthian Empire, a rival superpower, was far more embarrassing for Rome. Losing an entire legion to the Parthians was a major strategic and political blow. It is plausible that Roman authorities preferred the story of a heroic last stand against disorganized tribes in Britain to the humiliating truth of being outmaneuvered and destroyed by a sophisticated military adversary. The British myth became a useful fiction, a piece of propaganda that covered up a far more damaging reality. The ghost story of the Ninth in Caledonia was, perhaps, more palatable than the hard truth of their destruction in the East. So, where does this leave us? We have competing theories, each with its own fragments of evidence. The traditional story of destruction in Britain, while romantic, is largely discredited by the archaeological finds in the Netherlands. Then we have the theory of a redeployment to the Rhine, followed by a final, fatal campaign in the east against the Parthians. This seems to be the most likely scenario, supported by the context of Roman military movements and the writings of historians like Cassius Dio. But there's a third, less dramatic possibility we must consider: the bureaucratic end. Legions could be disbanded for reasons other than combat. Sometimes, after heavy losses, a legion's name and number would be retired, its surviving men absorbed into other units. This was known as damnatio memoria, a condemnation of memory, often for disgrace or mutiny, though it could also happen for practical reasons. Could the Ninth have suffered such heavy casualties in one of the Eastern Wars that it was simply easier to disband them and strike their name from the records? In this scenario, there was no single, dramatic final battle. Instead, the legion simply faded away, its name erased from official lists, its legacy disappearing into the vast Roman administrative machine. Their disappearance wouldn't have been a mystery to the Romans at the time, but a simple administrative footnote, which over the centuries grew into the legend we know today. The mystery of the Ninth Legion is a perfect example of how history is not a static set of facts, but a constantly evolving investigation. For every piece of evidence we find, new questions arise. Was the story of their massacre in Britain a deliberate piece of Roman propaganda? Did the empire quietly move them to another hotspot, only for them to be annihilated in a different, less convenient war? Or was their disappearance something far less dramatic, a case of bureaucratic tidying up, a legion disbanded, and its memory erased? The truth is, we may never know for certain. The records are incomplete, the archaeological evidence is scattered across a continent, and the mists of time have clouded the final chapter of Legio IX Hispana, but the search continues. With every new inscription dug from the soil, with every re-examination of an ancient text, we get a little closer to solving one of the greatest historical mysteries of the Roman Empire. The story of the Ninth Legion is a powerful reminder that history is a puzzle with many missing pieces, and sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that are not true. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more historical investigations. The story of the Lost Legion doesn't end in China. For many historians, the idea of Roman soldiers marching thousands of miles across Asia, only to become border guards for the Han Dynasty, seems a bit far-fetched. They argue for a much simpler, and perhaps more brutal, explanation. To find it, we don't need to look east to China, but back to the very place where the Legion's story began, the deserts of the Parthian frontier. Imagine this scene. The sun beats down relentlessly on a vast, shimmering desert. There's no shade, no water, just endless sand and rock under a blistering sky. A Roman legion, tens of thousands of men clad in heavy armor, is on the march. They are disciplined, they are organized, but they are out of their element. This isn't the green countryside of Gaul or the rolling hills of Italy. This is the domain of a different kind of warrior. Suddenly, the horizon darkens. Not with clouds, but with a storm of dust kicked up by thousands of horse hooves. The Parthian cavalry, they are the masters of this terrain. Unlike the Romans, who fight on foot in tight formations, the Parthians are a fluid, mobile force of horse archers. They don't charge head-on into the Roman shields, that would be suicide. Instead, they employ a terrifyingly effective tactic. They gallop in wide circles around the legion, staying just out of range of the Roman javelins, the pila. From this safe distance, they unleash a storm of arrows. The sky goes black with them. They rain down on the packed Roman ranks, piercing shields, armor, and flesh. The sound is a constant, horrifying hiss, punctuated by the thud of arrows hitting their mark and the cries of wounded men. The Romans form their famous testudo, the tortoise formation, locking their shields overhead to create a protective shell. It's an incredible display of discipline under fire, but it can't last forever. The men are cooking alive inside their armor, the shields grow heavy. And the Parthians have a seemingly endless supply of arrows, resupplied by camels carrying huge caches. Frustrated, a Roman commander might order a charge. A cohort of legionaries breaks from the formation, shouting their battle cries as they run towards the enemy, but it's a trap. The Parthians feign a retreat, luring the Romans further and further out into the desert, away from the main body. Once the legionaries are exhausted, strung out, and disorganized, the Parthians turn. This is their most famous and deadly maneuver, the Parthian shot. As they gallop away, the riders twist in their saddles and fire arrows backward over their horses' rumps. The pursuing Romans, with their guard down, are completely exposed. The attack is devastating, the charge falters, and the survivors are picked off one by one. This was the nightmare of Roman commanders in the East. It is how the mighty consul Crassus and his 7 legions were annihilated at the Battle of Carrhae, the very battle where our lost legion was first captured. It was a catastrophic defeat that haunted Rome for generations, so here's the theory. After being freed from their initial servitude, what if the legionaries of the Lost Ninth weren't sent east, but were instead re-enlisted or formed into a new unit to fight the Parthians once more? Perhaps they were part of another, later Roman campaign in the east. There were many such campaigns, many battles fought in those same deserts. Is it possible that our legion, seeking to avenge their earlier defeat, met the exact same fate as Crassus's army? A second, devastating encounter with the Parthian cavalry. But this time, there was no famous consul to lend his name to the disaster. It was just one legion among many, lost in the vastness of the desert. This raises a chilling question about Roman history. We know Rome was brilliant at propaganda. They celebrated their victories with monumental arches and grand triumphs. But what about their failures? How often did Rome simply erase a humiliating defeat from the history books? If a single legion was wiped out, far from the eyes of the Senate and the people of Rome, would it even be recorded? It's entirely possible that the official report would be sanitized. The legion might be listed as disbanded or merged with another unit. The embarrassing truth that they were utterly destroyed by the same enemy, in the same way, for a second time would be quietly buried. Think about it. A story of a legion fighting its way across Asia to serve a Chinese emperor is a tale of incredible endurance. It's romantic, but a story of a legion being annihilated in a dusty, pointless skirmish on a forgotten frontier. That's just a failure. It's an administrative headache and a blot on the empire's record of military invincibility. It's the kind of story that an empire built on the myth of its own power would have every reason to suppress. So, instead of a grand adventure, the final chapter for the Lost Legion might have been a short, brutal, and unrecorded tragedy. A ghost legion, not because they marched to the end of the world, but because their true, grim fate was deliberately forgotten, erased by an empire that couldn't afford to admit its own vulnerability. A final, desperate battle under a merciless sun, their last moments marked only by the whistle of Parthian arrows and the endless, indifferent sand. It's a bleak and sobering thought that these soldiers, who had already endured so much, simply vanished, not into legend, but into a historical cover-up. Their sacrifice and their end were deemed too inconvenient for the grand narrative of Roman glory, but there is one final possibility. History is written by the victors, a familiar saying. But what if history isn't just written, but actively rewritten? What if the greatest power isn't the sword, but the seal that erases a name from a scroll? Today, we step into the heart of Roman power, the Senate chamber, where legacies were forged and, sometimes, deliberately broken. We're not just talking about battlefield defeats. We're talking about a punishment so complete, it aimed to wipe a legion from memory itself. A practice known as damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. But could even Rome truly erase a legend? Imagine the scene. The year is 09 AD. 3 entire Roman legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, march deep into the Teutoburg forest in Germania. They are led by an experienced, but perhaps overconfident, governor named Publius Quinctilius Varus. He trusts his guide, a Germanic chieftain named Arminius, who was raised in Rome, educated as a Roman, and even granted citizenship. Varus sees him as an ally, but Arminius is playing a long, deadly game. He is secretly uniting the Germanic tribes, luring Varus and his 20,000 men into a perfectly orchestrated trap. For 3 days, in the dense, rain-soaked forest, the legions are ambushed. The terrain is their enemy as much as the Germanic warriors. The long Roman columns are stretched thin, unable to form their famous battle lines. It's not a battle, it's a slaughter. Varus, seeing all is lost, takes his own life. The legionary eagles, the sacred standards that symbolize the honor of Rome, are captured. It is one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. When the news reaches Emperor Augustus in Rome, he is said to have wandered his palace for months, banging his head against the walls, crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The loss was immense, not just in men, but in pride, in prestige. The numbers of these 3 legions 17, 18, and 19 were never used again. They became specters, bad omens, numbers so stained by disaster that they were retired forever. This was a common Roman practice. When a legion was destroyed so completely, its number was often considered cursed, a dark spot on the otherwise pristine record of Roman military might. It was a way of acknowledging a trauma, of quarantining the shame associated with that number. But this raises a profound question. What about a legion whose fate was even more ambiguous, one that wasn't just defeated, but simply disappeared? Let's fast forward a century, where in Britannia, the wild, northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Around the year 108 AD, the 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, is stationed at Ebercum, modern-day York. They are a veteran legion with a long and storied history, having fought alongside Julius Caesar himself. They are the seasoned guardians of the northern border, tasked with pacifying the aggressive tribes of Caledonia, what we now call Scotland. And then, after about 120 AD, they vanish from all Roman records. The last definitive record we have of the 9th is their work on rebuilding the fortress at York. After that, silence, no battle reports, no transfer orders, no retirement records. They are simply gone. For centuries, the popular theory, the one that has inspired countless books and movies, is that the 9th marched north into the mists of Scotland to quell a rebellion and was annihilated, wiped out to a man by the fierce Caledonian tribes. It's a romantic, dramatic end for a famous legion. It fits the narrative of the savage frontier swallowing up the might of Rome. This theory held sway for a very long time. It explained the silence perfectly, a defeat so total, so humiliating, that perhaps Rome chose not to record it. An entire legion lost, its eagle captured, its memory a source of shame. It would make sense for the imperial administration to simply stop mentioning them, to let them fade from the official narrative. But as archaeologists and historians dug deeper, the evidence for a great slaughter in Scotland just wasn't there. No mass graves, no battlefield sites, no captured Roman equipment turning up in native settlements. The story began to unravel. New evidence started to emerge, fragments from across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. Tiles stamped with the insignia of the 9th Legion were found not in Britain, but in the Netherlands, at a place called Noviamagus. This suggested that at least a detachment of the 9th was transferred from Britain to the Rhine frontier sometime after 120 AD. Historians began to piece together a new timeline. It seemed the 9th wasn't wiped out in Scotland after all. Instead, they were likely transferred out of Britain, perhaps to fight in another conflict, possibly in the East, but this just deepens the mystery. If they weren't destroyed, where did they go? And why did they disappear from the records? One theory is that they were disbanded, but not for a single, glorious defeat. It's possible the legion suffered heavy casualties over a series of campaigns, perhaps on the Rhine or during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea. A legion could be ground down over time, its numbers dwindling until it was no longer a viable fighting force. At that point, the remaining soldiers would be absorbed into other legions, and the 9th Legion's number and title would simply be retired. No grand catastrophe, but a slow, attritional death. This brings us back to the cold, calculating heart of the Roman state. We are in the Senate chamber, torches cast long, flickering shadows on marble walls. The emperor sits, not as a warrior, but as an administrator, his face obscured by the gloom. Before him, clerks are sealing scrolls with wax, the official records of the empire. Every entry, every omission, is a deliberate act of political control. Rome didn't just conquer with armies, it controlled the world with bureaucracy. It curated its own story, its own invincible image, and in this chamber, a decision is made. Not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet of an office, a legion has become inconvenient. Perhaps it suffered a string of minor defeats, tarnishing its once great name. Perhaps it was involved in a political scandal, backing the wrong man in a civil war. Or perhaps it was simply ground down to nothing on some forgotten frontier, its slow demise a testament to the brutal cost of empire, a cost the state would rather not advertise. The order is given. Stop writing the name. Stop issuing its pay. Transfer the last of its men. Let the number fall into disuse. No dramatic announcement is needed. No public declaration of shame. The most effective way to destroy a legacy is not to condemn it, but to simply stop talking about it. The scribes dip their quills in ink and continue their work, but one name is now conspicuously absent. It's a quiet, bureaucratic execution. Perhaps the legion did not vanish in battle, but in silence. This is the true power of damnatio memoria. It wasn't always a dramatic chiseling of a name from a monument. Sometimes it was the stroke of a pen, or rather, the lack of one. The Ninth Legion's fate becomes a haunting example of this. They may have been erased for a much simpler reason. They ceased to be useful to the narrative of an eternal, ever-victorious Rome. Their end, whatever it was, didn't fit the story Rome wanted to tell about itself. So, their story was simply concluded. The book was closed. But their legend refused to disappear. The silence from Rome created a vacuum, and human imagination rushed to fill it. The story of the Lost Legion of Scotland was too good, too compelling to die. It spoke to our fascination with unsolved mysteries, with the fall of the mighty, and with the idea of a wild place that even Rome could not tame. The Ninth Legion may have been erased from the official records, but in doing so, Rome accidentally created an even more powerful legacy for them. They became more than soldiers, they became a myth. A ghost story whispered on the edges of empire, a legend that has outlived the empire that tried to forget them. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Roman history. If you're fascinated by the mysteries the past leaves behind, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next exploration. What do you think happened to the Ninth Legion? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. What happens when an army disappears, when the disciplined tramp of thousands of soldiers fades into an unnerving silence? The immediate aftermath is one of confusion, of desperate messages sent by couriers riding hard through the night. It's a scramble for information, a flurry of reports that contradict each other. For the families left behind, it's the beginning of a long, agonizing wait that, for many, will never end. Wives, sons, and daughters scanning the horizon for a familiar figure who will never return. In Rome, the news arrives not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, creeping dread. An entire legion, a cornerstone of imperial power, a symbol of Roman might vanished. The initial response is disbelief, followed by a quiet, determined effort to contain the news, to prevent panic from spreading through the empire like a plague. But secrets of this magnitude have a way of seeping out, whispered in taverns and markets, carried along the trade routes until the story takes on a life of its own. In the borderlands of Britannia, where the Legion was last seen, the void they left is felt immediately. The delicate balance of power is shattered. Local tribes, once held in check by the formidable presence of Roman steel, grow bolder. Small-scale raids escalate. Forts that once projected an aura of invincible authority now seem vulnerable, isolated outposts in a hostile landscape. For the Roman soldiers who remain, a new kind of fear sets in. It's not the fear of a pitched battle, but the fear of the unknown. They patrol the same misty forests, gaze into the same dense fog, and wonder. What happened to their comrades? Were they ambushed? Did they march into a trap, or did something far stranger, something from the old tales of this damp and mystical island, consume them? The silence of the Ninth Legion becomes a character in itself, a malevolent presence that haunts the northern frontier. The official records fall silent, the name of the Legion is scrubbed from military rosters. It's as if Rome itself is trying to forget, to cauterize a wound by pretending the limb was never there. But history, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And into this vacuum of fact, the seeds of legend begin to grow. Centuries pass, the Roman Empire itself crumbles, its great cities falling into ruin. The eagle standards are broken, but the story of the Lost Legion does not die. It survives, passed down through generations. It's told by Celtic bards around crackling fires, the tale of the invaders who marched north and never returned, swallowed by the vengeful spirits of the land. It's whispered by Anglo-Saxon settlers who build their homes on the foundations of old Roman forts, feeling a chill in the air that has nothing to do with the English weather. The story changes with each telling. In some versions, the legionnaires are massacred in a final, glorious battle against overwhelming odds. In others, they are cursed by a druid, forced to march for eternity as a ghostly phalanx, their armor clattering in the Highland winds. The lack of concrete evidence, the very thing that frustrated Roman commanders, becomes the fuel for the myth. The mystery is the magic. It allows people to project their own fears, their own hopes, and their own sense of wonder onto the blank canvas of history. The Lost Legion becomes more than just a military unit. It transforms into a symbol of courage, of folly, of the ultimate confrontation with the unknown. Then comes a new age, an age of rediscovery. The Victorians, with their insatiable appetite for history, romance, and empire, seize upon the story of the Lost Legion. They see in it a reflection of their own imperial ambitions and anxieties. Archaeologists dig in the shadow of Hadrian's Wall, hoping to unearth a definitive clue, a shield boss, a helmet, anything that could solve the puzzle. Painters dip their brushes and bring the legend to life on vast canvases. We see dramatic, romanticized scenes, brave centurions making a last stand against a horde of painted warriors, the Roman eagle held defiantly aloft against a stormy Scottish sky. These images are not history, they are art, and they are powerful. They shape the public imagination in a way no dry academic text ever could. The Legion is no longer just a ghost story, it is a national epic, a tale of heroic sacrifice in the wild north. It speaks to a fascination with glorious failure, with the idea of a noble endeavor meeting a tragic, mysterious end. The story of the Ninth becomes a part of the British identity, a foundational myth of the land itself. The 20th century arrives, and the legend finds its most potent modern form. In 1954, a writer named Rosemary Sutcliffe publishes a novel for young adults called The Eagle of the Ninth. This book, more than any historical treatise or archaeological find, cements the story of the Lost Legion in the global consciousness. It tells the story of a young Roman officer, Marcus Flavius Aquila, who ventures north of the wall to discover the truth about his father's Lost Legion and to recover its stolen eagle standard. It's a brilliant adventure story, filled with danger, honor, and a deep respect for the people and the landscape of ancient Britain. But it does something more. It gives the faceless, nameless soldiers of the Ninth a human story. It gives them a hero. Millions of readers, young and old, are captivated. For many, this novel becomes their first and most enduring encounter with Roman Britain. It's so powerful that for decades, many people accept its fictional account as historical fact. The book's success demonstrates the incredible power of storytelling to shape our understanding of the past. A good story, it turns out, is often more persuasive than a pile of ambiguous evidence. The cultural fascination doesn't stop there. The Eagle of the Ninth inspires movies, television series, and countless other books. Modern reenactment groups, dedicated to recreating Roman military life with meticulous accuracy, often focus on the Ninth Legion. They march in replica armor, practice drills, and in doing so, they keep the memory of the Legion alive in a very physical, tangible way. They become a living link to the past, their hobnailed sandals treading the same ground their historical counterparts might have walked. The story also seeps into tourism. The ruins of Roman forts along Hadrian's Wall, places like Vindolanda and Chester's, become sites of pilgrimage for those enthralled by the legend. Visitors walk through the misty ruins, trying to imagine what life was like for the soldiers stationed at the edge of the known world. They look out over the rolling hills to the north and feel a sense of the immense, intimidating wilderness that lay beyond the frontier. The absence of the Legion is what makes these places feel so alive with possibility. Every stone, every ditch, every artifact pulled from the soil seems to whisper a piece of the puzzle. So, what do we actually know? The truth is, frustratingly little. The historical record is a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. The last definitive record of the Ninth Legion, Legio IX Hispana, places them in Britain around the year 108 AD, stationed at Ebercombe, modern-day York, After that, they disappear from imperial records. For a long time, the prevailing theory, popularized by the myths, was that they marched north into Caledonia, modern Scotland, to quell a rebellion and were completely annihilated around the year 117 AD. It was a clean, dramatic, and satisfying explanation. It fit perfectly with the romantic narrative of the untamable Scottish tribes and the limits of Roman power. However, modern archaeology has complicated this picture. Fragments of inscriptions and tile stamps bearing the insignia of the Ninth have been found in the Netherlands, suggesting that at least some detachments of the Legion were transferred to the continent after their time in Britain. This evidence challenges the classic story of a single, catastrophic wipeout in Scotland. The reality might be far more mundane and perhaps more historically plausible. Legions were not static entities, they were often broken up, their cohorts and centuries redeployed to different frontiers as military needs shifted. It's possible the Ninth Legion was gradually disbanded, its soldiers absorbed into other units. Perhaps it suffered heavy casualties in a series of unrecorded conflicts, not in one grand battle, but in a grinding war of attrition, and was eventually deemed no longer combat effective. Maybe its eagle standard was lost in one of these smaller engagements, a deep shame that led to the unit being formally dissolved and its name erased. This theory is less cinematic, less romantic, but it might be closer to the messy, complicated truth of how empires manage their vast and overstretched military resources. The information gap, that core of the mystery, remains. The new evidence doesn't solve the puzzle. It just adds more pieces, rearranging our understanding, but offering no final, definitive picture. We may never know for certain how they fell, or if they fell at all. And perhaps that is the most important part of their legacy. The story of the Lost Legion teaches us something profound about history itself. It shows us that history is not just a collection of facts and dates, it is a story we tell ourselves. When the facts run out, we fill the gaps with myth, with art, and with imagination. We do this because we need meaning. We need narratives to make sense of the chaos of the past. The silence of the Ninth Legion created a space for us to explore timeless themes, courage in the face of the unknown, the clash of cultures, the rise and fall of empires, and the haunting power of mystery.
As we close this chapter of the Chrono Archives, remember, the past is never truly gone. It waits patiently in the shadows of forgotten ruins, in the echoes of ancient voices, and in the timeless lessons that still guide us today. It waits to be remembered by curious minds like yours. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the annals of time. If today's exploration of lost civilizations, mythical legends, or historical enigmas ignited your passion for the past, hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite moment or what you'd love to see next, and most importantly, subscribe to the Chrono Archives and continue the journey through time. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode where we unearth buried secrets, decode ancient mysteries, and bring history's greatest stories back to life. Together, we'll keep the flame of the past burning bright. Until next time, fellow time travelers, keep questioning, keep discovering, and keep remembering. The Chrono Archives, where the past lives forever.